worked our way through elementary and inspectional reading. In the last video in this series, we looked at the first steps of analytical reading, pigeonholing a book. Today, we're going to tackle how to X-ray a book in our journey through How to Read a Book, the Classic Guide to Intelligent Reading by Mortimer J. Adler and Charles Van Doren. Hi there, I'm Linda Maxey, the author of the Library Lynn Guides to Nonfiction. As I mentioned, I'm working my way through How to Read a Book, the Classic Guide to Intelligent Reading. This is part 6 in the series. So if you'd like to check out the first 5 videos, the playlist is below. Once again, I'll simplify things the best I can while hoping to get across the main points that our authors make. They reveal an important point at the end of this chapter, which I'm going to tell you first when we start getting into it. If they had made this point at the beginning of the chapter, it would have been much easier for me to grasp their points, and I wouldn't have felt the sense of panic, which made me border on rage by the time I was finished. I wish I were exaggerating about that, but I'm not. And I promise I'll get to this point in just a minute. What they're trying to get across is really not all that hard. I think it's just the way they arrange their information that makes it so difficult to understand. And that's ironic because today's lesson is really all about how to understand a book's skeleton. It's about how to figure out what holds it all together. So let's review for a second before we get started. Here are the 4 stages of reading. We've covered elementary and inspectional reading in previous videos, but the heart of this entire book deals with analytical reading. Last week, we covered the first rule of analytical reading, which is this. Rule number 1, you must know what kind of book you are reading, and you should know this as early in the process as possible, preferably before you begin to read. Okay, so now we're going to cover the next 3 rules for this type of reading. Here's what they waited until the end of the chapter to say. All of these rules work together. They're accomplished more or less at the same time. That's the first thing. And the second thing is, you don't have to read through the entire book one time to accomplish this step before you can move on to the next steps of analytical reading. All of it, like inspectional reading, is more or less done at the same time. So I read through this chapter with a growing sense of alarm and then indignation that they kept throwing these rules out. I thought, my gosh, are they crazy? They already said skim the book before you even begin with analytical reading. How many more times are we going to have to read a single book to get this all figured out? But at the end they say no. You follow the 4 rules in this stage at the same time you implement all the others. They just want to make sure you understand these 4 rules because understanding the book is going to be a whole lot easier, and it really hinges on whether or not you get this part. Are you curious now to see what you have to do? Let's go. They begin this chapter with a quote. Every book has a skeleton hidden between its covers. Your job as an analytical reader is to find it, and that's what these next 3 rules help you do. Rules 2 and 3 tell you that it's necessary to discover 2 things about a book by the time you're done with it: the unity and its parts. The skeleton together is a unity of these parts, the bones. Or the bones, put together correctly, makes a complete skeleton. How does that work with a book? Well, let's start with Rule 2. State the unity of the whole book in a single sentence or at most a few sentences. Well, let's look at an example. They give plenty of examples, of course. I'm just going to share with you the first one they give. This is Aristotle's summary of the Odyssey. A certain man is absent from home for many years. He is jealously watched by Poseidon and left desolate. Meanwhile, his home is in a wretched plight. Suitors are wasting his substance and plotting against his son. At length, tempest-tossed, he himself arrives. He makes certain persons acquainted with him. He attacks the suitors with his own hand and is himself preserved while he destroys them. That example is a short paragraph, I guess. It's 3 very long sentences, but I guess that counts. And then they go on to give their idea of their own examples from books like The Wealth of Nations by Adam Smith. But I think you get the idea, so we're not going to cover those. They do say that sometimes the title, preface, or introductory paragraphs will give you a hint about the unity, but you should never take what the author says for granted. It's up to you to discover what the book means to you. And again, you can't really complete this rule until you've read the book. So that's rule number 2, unity. Rule number 3, set forth the major parts of the book and show how these are organized into a whole by being ordered to one another and to the unity as a whole. Is that crystal clear? It wasn't for me either. But think of it this way. The unity is the skeleton. The major parts are like the individual bones or the parts that make up the skeleton. So how do you find the parts of a book? You make an outline. But wait, you may be thinking, isn't that what the table of contents and the chapter headings or subheadings do? Well, that's what I thought. But of course not, oh naive one. Just because an author thinks they've got everything figured out, that doesn't mean they actually do. They go on to tell how some ambitious and obsessive souls sometimes create outlines that are longer than the book. If you're the type of person who does things like that, then you don't need to be watching this video. So here's an example they give. The Constitution of the United States. They lay it out exactly as it is written in the Constitution, and here is what this looks like. But they also add their own notes on what each individual part and section says. I think they do this because it's simple and easy to understand. So right here is where I came dangerously close to throwing this book out my back door in hopes that some coyotes would pick it up for a game of catch. My heart was literally beating fast when they made a real attempt to calm me down because I believe even they know how ridiculous this sounds. They said it's not important to do this perfectly. It's fine to just jot down the main points. The important thing is that you spend some time thinking about the parts of the book, what they're saying, and how they're organized. Okay then. I did calm down a little bit after that. An earlier video, I think it was video number 4, in that chapter, they said you could use the end papers at the back of the book to jot down the outline. And you could do that. Or you could have a separate notebook or a commonplace book for things like that to keep your book tidy. That's up to you. But I do see their point that jotting down the structure of the book in this way is most definitely your best bet on grasping what the book is saying more completely. Authors make outlines and cover them up with facts and prose. Your job is to sift through the facts and prose and try to uncover the outline. So that's rules 2 and 3. Now we'll move on to our last rule of the day. Rule 4. Find out what the author's problems were. What's your problem, Homer? No, not that kind of problem. They say this really is just another way of approaching rules 2 and 3 and clarifying some things for yourself in the process. When an author writes a book, they start with a question or a set of questions. In the book I've been reading, In the Spirit of Crazy Horse, one of the questions is, did Leonard Peltier shoot and kill 2 FBI agents in 1975? That's not the only question. There are others, like, why were the Native Americans protesting? Why should the FBI reports be doubted? And many others. Figuring out what questions the author is attempting to answer will, of course, help you better understand what you're reading. They do caution here against falling for the intentional fallacy. You're in danger of doing this if you try to determine what the author was thinking when they wrote the piece. Can you prove Peter Matheson was just setting out to vindicate Native Americans because he was sympathetic to them? No, you can't prove that because you don't know what was in his mind. Only he knew that. The question is, does he adequately answer the questions that he is asking? They also spend a bit of time helping you separate theoretical questions from practical questions that the author may be asking. If you remember in our last video, they made a great distinction between theoretical literature and practical literature. If the questions that you find being asked are primarily theoretical, chances are good it's a theoretical book. And of course, theoretical just means the knowledge of the subject. But if the questions are primarily practical, chances are good it's a practical book. And of course, practical means applying the knowledge that was theoretical into doing something concrete. So there you have it. They call these 4 rules pigeonholing, determining unity, parts, and problems as the first stage of analytical reading. I don't like the term stage here because to me it implies you have to complete all of that before you can move on to the next things, and that's not what they're saying. They mean this is something you should have in the back of your mind as you take notes and read through the book. But you will be doing other things too, and we'll talk about some of those things in the next video when we cover Chapter 8, Coming to Terms with an Author. So that's it for today. For more excellent nonfiction books that you can use to practice Adler and Van Doren's advice, check out my books. Library Lynn's curated collection of superlative nonfiction and Library Lynn's biographies, autobiographies, and memoirs. And until next time, happy reading!